All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Um, Again, we're excited to have you all on, and we might have a few more attendees still joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get rocking and rolling here. So, um, we did not realize when we chose to set this up through the town hall feature with Microsoft Teams that attendees are not allowed to speak. And so um, we will not be able to have you introduce yourselves this morning like we were hoping to do. Um, and but we are going to go ahead and move forward at this point. I think what we're going to try and do is when we take our break here in a little bit, we're going to send out another link and have you rejoin um, a webinar format, and then we will be able to have you introduce yourselves at that point when we return from the break. Because we would like to be able to have a little bit more interaction with the attendees and our presenters that way. We will go ahead and do our Q&A session. And actually, what we might do is we might just break and then come back and do the Q&A session after that. That way we can have a little more interaction if somebody wants to jump on and chat a little bit or something. So, but we're going to try that. But right now we're going to go ahead and jump in here and um, what we're looking at today. So this is the first virtual session of our low-tech process-based restoration workshop, and we'd like to thank you for joining us. My name is Caleb Carter. I'm the district manager for the Weston County Natural Resource District, and we are hosting this workshop in partnership with, let me scroll down here, with some of our partners that have helped in planning this, Pheasants Forever, Wyoming Game and Fish, Mule Deer Foundation, as well as the Thunder Basin Grasslands Prairie Ecosystem Association. Really grateful for their support for the community members that have helped to put this together. And Montana Conservation Corps members have also been really helpful um, in this process, as well as some contractors that we worked with as well. Um, and so really grateful for everybody's input. Grateful that you all found this beneficial enough to want to join and be a part of it as well. So um, with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is going to be Paul Jones. He is the consultant that we're working with. He is out of Gunnison, Colorado, and the owner of Tamichi Creek Ecosystem Services. And if I got that wrong, Paul, you can correct me on that. But he's been doing this work for a long time, and we're grateful to be able to learn from his experience and have him presenting today, talking a little bit about some of the challenges that we see within erosion in the West and how we can address some of those challenges. And Brian Jensen, he is with Wyoming NRCS, and he is going to be presenting to us on some of these specific degradation challenges that we see and kind of sharing some of the projects that have been done in Wyoming specifically to address these challenges and some of the projects that have been out there. And so we're really excited to have both of them on board. And so, Paul, I'll turn the time over to you to go ahead and start your presentation. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I apologize for the confusion on the settings for the town hall. So we're not going to do introductions right now, but we are going to come back and do those a little bit later. So thanks, everybody. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, so as Caleb mentioned, I'm out of Gunnison, Colorado. I started working with wet matter restoration a number of years ago, centered around Gunnison sage grouse when I was working with what is now Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Caleb's asked me to kind of give you an introduction into reading the landscape and taking a look at how do we figure out where we're going to do one of these projects and what are the things we need to think about when we're doing that. So I will try to jump into this right away. Typically, I'm a pretty informal individual, so if you guys do have questions, please jot them down, and I'll try to answer them as they come in. But with that, I will share my screen here. Yeah. So water is kind of one of the formative processes that we see on Earth. And in fact, I would argue that if we encountered Earth from space, we probably would call it water. And because, while we commonly know that, some 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, when you factor in that we also have large quantities of ice on the polar regions, and then typically at any point in time, the Earth itself is covered with clouds. Water is really the predominant thing that we see on the face of the Earth. And one of the things the way I like to look at project planning is using the stream functions pyramid. This allows us to at least allows me to organize my thinking we can't change the geology of the sites that we're working in. We can't change the climate. We can't change the amount of water that's coming into the systems. But what we can affect is how that water moves across the landscape, the hydrology portion of the pyramid. We can influence how water moves across the landscape as it moves towards the channel. Once the water's in the channel, we can influence how water behaves in the channel. And then that gets us into the geomorphological aspects of things, where we can start looking at sediment transport and vegetation, large woody debris. And that ultimately gets us up to the upper levels, which is usually where most people are interested in us working. If you want to improve broodering habitat for Gunnison sage-grouse, we really need to think about these levels 1, 2, and 3. Our focus may be up here on 5, but really the places that we can really change things are down here in these lower levels of the stream function pyramid. Right, the water cycle that we all learned about in junior high or middle school. There's the same amount of water in the system as there's always been. It's a closed system. So if we're experiencing drought, why are we experiencing that drought if there's the same amount of water in the system? Well, there may be more water tied up in precipitation, or in vapor that ultimately comes down in the form of precipitation. Maybe we've lost some of our soil's capacity to hold water, this kind of renewable groundwater source, the shallow water table that's influenced by precipitation. And so these are areas that I've come to realize that if there's one place that we can focus our energies, it's understanding how the system that we're working in captures, stores, and releases water over time, and figuring out where we may be able to influence that. Are there some signs there that can help us determine what's going on? And to do that, we really have to understand the systems that we're in. There are some really critical things. Geomorphology and hydrology are complicated science with a lot of information, but trying to break that down into something that's simple and understandable, I've come to realize there's really two concepts that we need to understand, that are absolutely imperative that we understand when we think about trying to influence these systems. And if we don't pay attention to these things, we can have project failure on a pretty large scale. And the first thing that I really want to emphasize is understanding the concept of bank full discharge. And the hydrologists define this as the maximum discharge that the channel can convey without overflow onto the floodplain, right? So it's this point right here where the channel is full, and it hasn't gotten onto the floodplain yet. And this is really critical in our design, and this is kind of what it looks like, right? I have at this point a 90-year-old gauge station standing out here on the edge of Tamichi Creek on our property, and this is right at bank full. It is just cresting up onto the banks in these low-lying areas are wet, but this is the point of maximum energy within the channel. Once it breaks onto the floodplain, that river now has an opportunity to spread out across the floodplain. The surface roughness of the vegetation and the topography is going to slow that water down, and that energy arm is going to start to break off. But from a geomorphic perspective, geomorphologists and hydrologists look at bank full as the point of maximum energy within the channel. And that's going to be important here in a little bit, and I'll explain that a little more here as we move on. The second thing that we need to understand that's absolutely critical is the relationship between energy and velocity as it relates to water. And it's not a direct one-to-one relationship. It's a logarithmic relationship. If we double the speed at which water moves through the system, we increase its capacity, its kinetic energy, or its capacity to carry material by a factor of 8. And what we end up with, if we graph this, is a really rapid energy arm that increases exponentially, and it will increase infinitely as long as it's confined within the channel itself. Right. So this is what this capacity for water to have tremendous power is what allows natural features such as the Black Canyon of the Gunnison or the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone to form. We see these rivers that downcut through these massive rocky plateaus, and it's simply the energy that water can exert on the landscape when we compress it. It's the same thing that allows us to generate hydroelectricity, right? We take water and we squeeze it into smaller and smaller pipes and run it across a turbine. It'll spin that turbine and we can generate electricity. And it is this process that we're harnessing in process-based restoration. You know, we're not, the beauty of this approach is that we're not trying to build structures to force the earth to do something that it doesn't want to do. What we're doing is we're taking natural processes, the movement of water across landscapes and its ability to carry soil, the natural process of erosion. We're harnessing those processes and jump-starting that system and allowing the system to heal itself. And so, again, when we're on, when we actually get out in the field, I will be banging away on this every time that you hear me and you get tired of me talking about where do you think bank full is, where should, what if we ignore bank full, and how do we identify bank full? The whole idea of what we're trying to do is we're trying to harness this process, and this is a if you ever go through a hydrologic textbook or a textbook on geomorphology, you'll always see this some form of this illustration where the ability of a stream to carry material basically depends on its elevation. If it's flat, if the slope of the stream is flat, then we typically see aggradation. If it's steep, we generally see degradation. The sediment size that's carried by the stream is influenced by slope. And this becomes evident when we start looking at landscapes. Here's an example of a large alluvial fan. We see that we have this steep channel coming out of the mountains, and all of a sudden it hits this broad, flat floodplain, and it just starts dumping sediment. And these alluvial fans are actually, they're alluvial features, and they actually do, when they're functioning, they can store tremendous quantities of water. But the way that they develop is this process where we have this meandering stream coming out of a steeper section. As it hits this flat area, it spreads out. As it spreads out, it slows down. It starts to deposit material, which then forms a dam. The water, that slows the water down even more. It collects more and more material. And what we end up getting is this fan that develops at the base of this stream. And these alluvial fans are actually have these big lenses of coarse material. They're self-sorting. So what we'll end up with is coarser material down at the toe and finer material sorted on top of that. And we get these bands of coarse and fine material, which are ideal for storing water. And, this is the understanding how alluvial fans, we may not work on a lot of alluvial fans, though sometimes we do, but the process of understanding how these alluvial fans form allow us to visualize what we're trying to do when we're trying to take water out of an incised channel and put it onto the floodplain. We're basically mimicking this same behavior. And so understanding how this happens is an important building block in project design. This is a picture of an alluvial fan in Iraq. In Iran, they have a number of these fans, and what you'll notice is we can see water in these stream banks coming down onto the fan, but you'll notice that there's this line of ditches along the bottom of this alluvial fan that are being used for irrigation. And this is where some of a bulk of their agricultural products come from. If they're not directly irrigating out of the larger rivers, in these smaller settings, they have tremendous agricultural production. And my dad told me when I first showed him this photo, he told me about reading about these features when he was in high school back in the 1940s, that they literally, these are thousands of years of agriculture has taken place here, where they dig back into these alluvial gravels, they trace them back, and then they capture these alluvial bands into ditches, and they grow. They basically collect ditch upon ditch until they actually have a large amount of discharge. And obviously, it's still something that they're doing today, and it's still very important. And so this shows us that there can be water in places that we may not expect. And if we understand these processes, we can tap into utilizing them to restore degraded habitats. These are flow paths that I mapped when I came up here. This was just outside of Buffalo a few years ago. The first time I was asked to come up here and look at some of these things. And what you can see again is you see fine materials where the water is flowing faster. On the margins, we see coarser material. So these are areas where water is slowing down. These are areas where water is still moving relatively rapidly. And again, these systems are self-sorting. As water starts to slow down, these bigger pieces drop out first, and then our finer soil particles are deposited later. But whenever we see these are great clues to us that tell us, these are places where we can harness these activities. We can see how much material is moving in these systems. And if we can slow it down further upstream, we can deposit this material upstream rather than in the in-stream channel itself. So one of the things that, one of the first places that I learned some of this stuff was through Dave Rosgen and his Rosgen classification of natural rivers. Prior to Rosgen's stream classification, we didn't have any real way of talking about streams in a uniform or consistent fashion. And what he was a Forest Service with he was a hydrologist with the U.S. Forest Service, and he was working all over the place, and he kept seeing these patterns repeat themselves. And he developed this theory and ultimately published this classification. And again, it's related to the landscape. We're looking at channel slopes in channels, and we see these channels, we see water in these channels behaving in mathematically predictable ways, that it repeats itself on the landscape. It doesn't matter where we are, but we see this pattern repeating itself over and over again. And so what we see are these steep and narrow channels that are high gradient, and then we see something different when that gradient begins to decrease. And we'll see we should see channel evolution that's predictable. And when we're working in these wet meadow settings, we're kind of working basically roughly probably 6% slope or less. And even then, we're probably typically working more in 2 to 4% or lower to really see the effectiveness of what we're doing. But to simplify this complicated classification system, I basically break these systems down into 2 types. We have V-shaped valleys that are steep. And typically we expect to see narrow channels. We expect to see rapid discharge. And we expect to see energy dissipated in vertical steps rather than horizontally. And we expect to see large coarse bed loads, so boulders and cobbles, right? And so, again, this is a perfect example, another alluvial fan. This is up in the Gunnison country, but you can see how the coarser material gets settled out and there's finer material is carried further downstream. The other type of valley is a U-shaped valley. And these are typically wide, flat floodplains. Discharge is slow, and energy is dissipated horizontally. We should see faster water on the outsides of meander bends, slower water on the inside. We see cutting on the outsides of those bends, and we see deposition on the point bars. And typically, our bed load is much finer. And right, the classic example is like the Mississippi River. When we look at the floodplain of the Mississippi River, we can see where this river has walked back and forth across this big flat plain. And we see excavation on those outside bends and just massive, flat, wet floodplains. Because I love Tamichi Creek, this is a picture near my home of the broad, flat, U-shaped valley that Tamichi Creek lies in. And we see these big, broad, meandering channels cutting through the floodplain. They can be smaller. This is also in the Gunnison Basin, but it's again, what we would anticipate when we look at the valley slope. We're seeing this meandering flow pattern. So that's the theory. And this is very useful because if we start training ourselves to look at gradient and we understand what channel types we should see in there, we have what Rosgen predicts and what mathematically should be there, and then we run into reality. And when we have a big, broad, flat floodplain and we see a vertical incision, a 4-foot or a 5-foot incision, that's kind of this vertical energy deposition, and where we would anticipate water actually dissipating its energy horizontally, this should be a clue to us that something is not functioning in the system. When we see, again, this big, broad, flat floodplain, but a deeply entrenched, narrow, straight channel, this is something that doesn't fit. And when we see this, rather than driving by it and not paying any attention, we should be asking ourselves, wait a minute, what's going on here? Rosgen tells us, and the math tells us, that we should see water that's on the surface or near the surface. We should see either a meandering flow channel, or we should see a multi-threaded channel. Instead, we see this deeply incised V-shaped channel. This doesn't fit into the landscape that we're looking at. Obviously, fences in the air don't keep birds out, so there's no reason for a fence to be suspended in the air like this. This should tell us that we have something going on. If we know when the fence was built, this gives us an idea of how fast this system is changing. where we have a vertical head cut with water cascading down and undermining the head cut through the mechanical erosion of water. This unless we're in a steep, narrow gradient reach, this landscape form doesn't fit with what we would expect to see mathematically. So these should all be things that if we see these, they should stand out to us, and it should be a clue that something else is going on here, and maybe we need to take a deeper look at the landscape that we're in. One of the places that I started really thinking about this was down in the San Luis Valley. It's on the Trinchera Ranch. This is a really, really small tributary to a very small stream, and it had these massive erosional features, and it took me a while to figure it out, but we had a lot of placer and hydraulic mining that took place in this area. And what was interesting to me as I was down here, it was a stream that I was working on. We were trying to restore habitat for Rio Grande sucker and Rio Grande chub and Rio Grande cutthroat trout. And this side channel that had virtually no water in it, when it did have water, was moving huge quantities of material down into the Placer Creek, where we were trying to restore these fish populations. And I'm trying to understand what was going on. Ultimately stumbled across this photograph, and we can see that there's huge modifications. But it's interesting to me because there was enough water in that system that they were able to use hydraulic mining to excavate this massive channel. And so that got me thinking about channel dynamics and trying to understand how, if I'm trying to restore native fish in this setting, how do I deal with all the sediment that's coming in off of this side channel? So I plotted that energy arm using a program that you can get from the USGS, and I'll talk about this at the end of our session today. There's a program called StreamStats, and it's just come online here in Wyoming in the last 2 years, and there's quite a bit of information that you can get out of it. One of the things that I was able to do is I was able to plot these different flood flows on a graph. I converted it to pounds per square inch because I'm an imperial unit person. And what was interesting to see was that our bank full discharge, and bank full is most geomorphologists expect to see a bank full event every 2 years. Every 2 years, we should have the channel full of water and water starting to access the floodplain. That's important from a geomorphic perspective because that's where we have the maximum amount of energy for channel formation, but it's also really important from a vegetative perspective because we're getting water onto the floodplain and we're starting to refill that shallow water aquifer that can be very variable. And the more often we have water on the floodplain, the more water we're storing in the banks. And so on Spanish Creek, a bank full discharge of just over 1 CFS came in with a pressure of about 1 pound per square inch. So at a bank full event, anything sediment less than a pound could be mobilized. A 10-year flood was about 4 CFS, and it was exerting about 16 pounds per square inch on the sediment within the channel. A 50-year flood was about 8 CFS, and now we're moving 82 pounds, bed load that up to 82 pounds per square inch. And then a 100-year flood is about 24 CFS, and it's moving, it can move material that weighs up to 667 pounds. So it doesn't take a tremendous amount of discharge in the system to move sediment. So then I went back and I looked at the modeled, using the data from StreamStats, I looked at the modeled bank full geometries, and basically it was about 9 feet wide and a foot and a half deep. And so this should be our bank full event. Every 2 years, we should see water on the floodplain flowing out of this, and with this broad floodplain, that's what we would expect to see. Well, using LiDAR data, this is actually what we have. We have this deep entrenched channel. And when we look at that bank full flow, that flow that should be on the surface every 2 years, that point of maximum channel energy for this system, we can see that it's entrenched quite deeply. That's what this dark line is the cross-sectional area of the discharge, this discharge up here. And it's trapped down in the bottom of this deep, deep channel. This is a system that can't repair itself. And we basically lowered the water table over 6 feet in this channel. And so whenever we get flood events in here, we can move tremendous amounts of material, but we're never going to get moisture up on that floodplain. And like I said, when we overlay this graph on here, this blue line is the 100-year flood. For us to have a true bank full event where we have water on the banks, we've got a massive amount of water, and that volume of water that's in there is so powerful. It just perpetually keeps this system in a degraded state. Like I said, this is important when we think about if we're trying to manage for a specific suite of plants, understanding where our water table is compared to where it used to be can be very important. This is from the Sage Grouse Initiative. This looks at the rooting depth of a lot of plants. And one of the things that we see when we're trying to manage for brood-rearing habitat for greater Gunnison sage grouse, what we see a lot of times is sagebrush invading into wet meadows. And the reason for that is that sagebrush can be a very aggressive competitor for water as a deep taproot that can get down as deep as 8 feet, where most of the species that we're looking for brood-rearing habitat root in the top 1 to 2 feet of the system. Here on the Trinchera Ranch, they're managing, it's a trophy elk ranch, and they want to manage for habitat for elk. And so the species that they're looking for, they want a lot of robust native grasses and forbs, as well as woody veg component, aspen, cottonwood, and willows. So here's for the species that they're looking for, here's the average rooting depth of those grasses. Here's the average rooting depth for the woody species that they want. Here's where our bank full elevation, our bank full discharge is. And when we look at that and we compare it to, this is the depth that sagebrush can root down to. So sagebrush and the species that they're terming less desirable for their management objectives can easily root down into this existing water table, but the species that they're managing for can't. And so unless we actively work on lifting the grade of this channel, we're not going to see recovery of those species at the level that they want. And this can explain why many of our cottonwood gallery forests are no longer see reproduction in those forests, and why we're seeing these species die out, I think, is because we've lowered the water table in most of our streams, particularly here in eastern Wyoming. I'm seeing that again and again. We see these old dead cottonwoods laying on the banks, and we see no cottonwood regeneration. I think it has a lot to do with this loss of the water table. The other thing about sagebrush that's interesting is while it's an aggressive competitor for moisture, it doesn't like to have its feet wet. And so if we can reestablish the natural higher water table in these systems, if sagebrush is wet for up to 72 hours, if it's continually inundated, this large taproot is continually inundated for up to 72 hours, you can actually kill sagebrush simply by rebuilding that higher water table. And the sagebrush will move back out to the perimeters of these meadows, and we can reestablish this vegetation that we're interested in. This is another way of looking at the same thing. I stole this from an article in Bugle magazine about wet meadows. And this is a functioning wet meadow. We see this high water table. We have the stream has access to the floodplain. We have wet mesic vegetation, wetland facultative wet and wetland obligate species occupying this niche right next to the meadow. We've got willows and cottonwoods down here by the side of the meadow. And our more arid plants are restricted to the perimeters where we have a good, healthy populations of trees and shrubs, but the valley bottom itself is super, super moist. And what happens when we drain these, when something happens to drain these systems, what we end up doing is we get this negative feedback loop where I'm sorry, I've lost my cursor. We get a negative feedback loop that what happens is the water table begins to drop. Then our mesic vegetation no longer has access to a high water table. They start to fade out, and we end up getting more upland grasses and things like that moving in, sagebrush moving in adjacent to the stream. The other thing about sagebrush and conifers that encroach into these traditional riparian meadows that a lot of people don't think about is that these plants are there's a couple of things about them that we don't think about. One is because they're evergreens, they're transpiring every day of the year. Even during the winter when mesic vegetation is dormant and not transpiring moisture out of the soil, these more xeric species are, I've read estimates where I think it's back. I've read where we've got where conifers can take as much as on average, if you average it out over the forest, each stem, whether it's a young stem or an old stem, is basically transpiring 35 gallons of water a day. Sagebrush, I've read 2 to 3 gallons of water a day. And that's spread out over the year. But even if you're transpiring that in the winter, that's going to, the cumulative effect of that is adding to this drying of the system. The other thing that we get is we get sublimation, right? We capture snow or rain in the canopy where it's exposed to moving air, and it evaporates or sublimates before it ever reaches the ground. And so, we can get again, this is a negative feedback that we can get when we have conifer or evergreen encroachment like sagebrush down into these riparian wet meadow settings. In these systems that function correctly, we should have about 35% interflow coming through the soil into our stream bottoms. And we can have as much as 2% sublimation off of the ground, but in these canopies, we can have up to 12% of the precipitation being sublimated out of the system. And so when we have things like juniper encroaching into grasslands or sagebrush systems, there's a double whammy effect that we don't think about sometimes. And that is we're transpiring water out of the soil every day of the year. And when we have moisture falling into these systems, it's being captured in the canopy, and we can lose up to 12% of our precipitation through canopy intercept. This is, when we think about restoring things, we need to think about how channels kind of unwind. If we want to restore a channel or a floodplain, how does the system unwind? And this is a classic channel evolution model that was put together by Schum et al. Back in the 80s. And this is what we've all kind of worked with in the past. We have this idea that there's this single thread channel that somehow deepens. We never explain how, but we get incision. And then we get bank widening through bank failure. And then ultimately we get stabilization and deposition. And finally, we get another floodplain that develops inside this terrace. And that new floodplain is now shallower and less wide than it used to be. This is kind of what guided thinking for a long time. But again, like I said, one, it focuses on a single thread channel, which Rosgen's classification tells us we shouldn't always see, particularly in these lower gradient settings. And two, it doesn't explain how this channel gets deeper. So recently, this was 2012, a couple of geomorphologists, Kluwer and Thorne, came up with this idea of stage 0. And you'll recognize this right side of the figure looks just like Rosgen's stream classification. But rather than them classifying individual channel types, they break it down into these zones, right? We have the sediment supply zone in these steeper, higher gradient settings. And then we have these alluvial fans that develop at the mouths, kind of right there where we break onto our flatter terrain. This then water flows through the transfer zone, where we gain and lose sediment depending on channel function. And then ultimately we come down here to the depositional zone. And this is where fine sediments should be being deposited on the landscape, and we should see this multi-threaded, multi-braided channel, which they refer to as stage 0. And so to take that, that horizontal conception, put it into a model, this is the model that they developed. We start up here at the top at stage 0. We have this multi-threaded channel. We get incision of some sort, and we move into this single thread. Now, under natural conditions, there will be some channel processes that can kick it back up, and it can cycle between 1 and 2. But another thing that can happen is it can go into this channelized setting, and it gets locked into this, potentially gets, rather than cycling back to stage 0, it cycles to stage 3, where it might cycle back, or to stage 4, where it stays in this arrested development site. And what their hypothesis is in this article is that many of the streams that should have a stage 0 setting, or this multi-threaded, anastomized, braided channel, have gotten locked into these alternative steady states that are degraded, and that without inputs, they're going to be locked over here in stage 2 or stage 3. I think they call it 3S. And until we take active steps to actually manipulate the channel, we can't get back into this system. And so this is where that Spanish Gulch lies. It's locked in this perpetual state of arrested degradation. And many of our systems that we have, particularly in low gradient settings, have become locked into this, this alternative steady state. And they've been locked in this for such a long time. A lot of times we think this is normal, rather than moving back through a series of steps to getting back to this equilibrium where we have a multi-threaded channel. So that gets into, well, what causes these kinds of degradations? And I've become convinced that the single greatest impact to our riparian systems in the West was the introduction of the wagon. And obviously this is not on a meadow setting, this is on a steep road, but you can see the deep ruts that have developed here. And obviously this is not, this road is no longer functioning. Water on this road is trapped in these channels, and we're getting rapid and massive amounts of erosion. And it doesn't take lots of repeated travel to get there. Here's an example of a wagon moving across a wet prairie, and you can see that right behind it, there's quite a bit of impact. That lens of wet soil on the top is easily disturbed by these thin wheels, and we see this wagon moving down towards another road where we see another set of ruts. This is a photo of Custer's wagon train and his Black Hills expedition, and we can see the impacts of previous wagon movements here and here, and basically either repeated use by a low number of wagons, or a large number of wagons like this wagon train can easily impact this system. So And here's a picture that one of my friends, Sean Connor, took while they were doing a wet meadows restoration project. I think here in Western Wyoming, they encountered some historic reenactors that were following a segment of the Mormon Trail. And I love this photo because I think it shows, to me, it explains a lot of what we had going on. First, we have the wagon itself, and it is not self-propelled. It's being drawn by horses. The wagon itself, these freight wagons could carry up to 4 tons of materials, and they're on wheels, iron-bound wheels that are about 6 inches wide. And because they're not self-propelled, they can't go on the side slope. They don't want to ride through this rough sagebrush, and it's too wet for them to come up the center of the meadow, so they would go up the edge of the meadow. And what that would result in is, we think back to those first couple of pictures, is it would lead to these 2 little narrow depressions, parallel narrow depressions, and ultimately the valley will pinch off and they'll have to cross across the main stem of the valley. And when they do that, when we get a high flow event, where we get a bankful event, which is natural, the water coursing across sheeting across the landscape encounters these 2 parallel ruts. They begin running down the water, down these 2 little channels. These channels are straight and narrow. That increases velocity. We know if we double velocity, we increase the energy carrying capacity of the stream by a factor of 8, and we get this rapid energy arm. And in these really, really fine soils that we have in these depositional zones, we get rapid downcutting. And so I took that classic Schum model and I converted it. Now, I couldn't find a JPEG image of a wagon that showed it going through muddy terrain, so I used a Jeep instead. But this is what I think is missing from this model, is the idea that what we're missing is the impact. The incision is a result of these 2 parallel tracks intercepting flow and downcutting. And what we get is this red line shows us how much our water table is decreasing. And then we do get into what they were looking at, the bank failure, the widening. Now we have a lot of sediment in the system, and the system starts to rebuild itself. And ultimately, if left alone, we will end up with a setting where we have a recessed floodplain. We do have function down in the bottom, but we've lost all this bank storage. So these are the steps that I think we go through once we have a disturbance from a wheeled vehicle. Now, on the right-hand side, I've included different techniques that we can use at different points within this the evolution of this channel. And I'll talk about those here a little bit later this morning. This is another way of looking at that. This top section, this light blue polygon, is soil moisture. The green line represents the surface of the landscape, and we can see these multiple channels, this braided system. This is when we start getting an incision, and all of a sudden we start dropping the water table. As that incision gets deeper, our channel gets faster, we get this negative feedback loop. The more water that falls in the channel, the faster it goes, the more energy is released, and the deeper it entrenches itself. And ultimately, we lower our water tables. And that's what we're going to try and reverse through process-based restoration. This is a paper that came out last year from CSU. Has nothing to do with wet meadow restoration, but I think when I read it, it has to do with apex predators and the whole idea of trophic cascades and whatnot. And they were trying to demonstrate that trophic cascades, well, they wanted to test whether the theory of reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone resulted in a trophic cascade where we saw riparian areas restore themselves. And they couldn't find any evidence of that. But in reading this, I read the article and it jumped out at me that this is a perfect example of what we're dealing with. And so in their description of their study area, in the 1900s, the riparian zones were dominated by willows, and those willows extended up to 40 meters on average away from the stream margins themselves. In the 1920s, beaver were abundant, but by the 1930s, willows started disappearing. And since the 1950s, those willows are just restricted to the alluvium adjacent to the stream channels. By the 1950s, the beaver had disappeared. Streams were now high velocity and size channels that were disconnected from the floodplain. And then they stated that the current incision had not been seen for millennia. There was no correlation to precipitation, so it's not a climate change related issue. And the vegetation had shifted from a willow dominated system to a grassland system. And the hypothesis was that it was the loss of wolves allowed elk populations to expand, and elk basically ate all the willows. So to prove this, what they wanted to do was they chose to create a model where, create a model. And what they did was they put in 4 different study types or study sites. They put in a couple of dams, and they had a dammed area that was unfenced, a dammed area that was fenced, an undammed unfenced area, and an undammed fenced area. So the fenced area, the undammed unfenced area, they restored the water table, but elk browsing still continued. In their treatment area, where they controlled grazing through fencing and they restored the water table, the control area where there was no restored water table and unrestricted grazing, and then the other experimental plot was the undammed area, but that was fenced. They controlled grazing. And what was interesting was they raised the water level in July with the use of these dams about 15 inches. And what they in their study area and in the control area, they saw what they thought they would see. They in the fenced dammed site, willows grew to about 6 inches. Their annual growth rate was about 6 inches a year. And after 20 years, the willows were almost 12 feet. They were 11 and a half feet tall. If willows could get to just over 7 feet, they could withstand elk browsing. In the area that their control area, they only saw an average increase in height of 2 inches a year. And after 20 years, the willows were still only 6 feet tall. What was curious, though, was in their other 2 study sites, in the undammed and unfenced area, and in the dammed unfenced area and the undammed fenced area, they had very similar growth rates. 3.2 inches in the fenced area and 3.5 inches in the unfenced area, but they did have after 20 years, the willows were 8 feet tall. They were tall enough to resist browsing by elk in both sites. And they saw that as an anomaly. They stated, it is notable that the dam treatment and fence treatments had effects of similar magnitude. This suggests that well-watered plants could tolerate relatively heavy browsing. It also shows that the abstinence of engineering by beaver suppressed willow growth to a similar extent as did browsing. Thus, reducing browsing is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the restoration of willows. I struggled with this because they didn't really explain that process. They hypothesized that it was the absence of beaver. So what I did is I looked at their study sites and I was able to at least locate the general area that they were working in. And using LiDAR data, I was able to develop a cross section. I just randomly picked a cross section within an area. And what we see is this deeply entrenched system. We could see there were multiple channels throughout here. What's interesting is where the creek is now, this deeply incised area, if we look at the lip of that, it is higher than the valley bottom. And that doesn't make any sense. Why would water run uphill? It makes no sense at all. Yet we can see that this is a deep channel that has drained what would have been a wet meadow. I went and grabbed the stream stats data, and overlaid what the modeled data should look like. And again, what we can see is, yep, we have a really deep, wide channel that doesn't fit what the regional curves show us should be in this location. So, and then when we look at where that bank full discharge is now trapped in the channel, that flow that should be on the floodplain every 2 years is trapped down here in the bottom of the channel. There's no way that we can get the hydrologic benefits of that water onto the floodplain. And if we look at the rooting depths of willows in this floodplain, what we can see is that we have dropped the water table 3.5 feet below the historic rooting depth of willows. The reason that willows aren't here is not because of browsing from elk, but because we've lost our water table. So what could possibly cause that? The great thing about Yellowstone is we have historic maps. And so my transect was down here, roughly where the K is on Elk Creek. This is a map from 1886 that the USGS has on their topo site that you can download. And what we see is this wagon trail on the north side of Elk Creek. And again, this is where my transect was. And if we go back to the transect, it corresponds to this channel right here, is actually where the wagon road was. So this is 1886. The wagon road's here. Now we have 1907. We have more roads, but we still see this wagon road on the north side of the channel. And then we go to 1911, and suddenly the creek is now on the north side of the wagon road. I believe what we're seeing here is a documentation of road interception or road capture of the stream. And again, if we look at where this channel is compared to where it was, this was the channel, or this is the channel, but it was the historic wagon trail that was on the north side of Elk Creek prior to 1911. So, and then I just will close with this is before I turn it over to Brian, this is an example of this process happening on a modern road. This is outside of Poncha Pass in the Arkansas River drainage. I was up with some friends and we were driving on a Jeep road, and we encountered the Jeep road was suddenly turning into the creek. A beaver had built a pond in the old channel, flooded the floodplain, and now the road has cut down about 18 inches. There's an 18-inch head cut on this road as the stream is being gently swallowed by the road. With that, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Paul. That was very good.
Let me finish. Hang on a sec. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
All right. Are folks seeing that okay?
I can see it.
All right. Trying to, let me get my view correct. Okay. All right. Well, I'll jump right into it. We're just a few minutes behind schedule. And yeah, hopefully folks can hear me okay. But my name is Brian Jensen. I'm the Assistant State Conservationist for Partnerships with Wyoming NRCS. I'm based in Casper. And I was previously the state biologist for Wyoming NRCS. And through that role and in my current one, I guess I've had the fortune of working on this issue and promoting these practices and opportunities for many years. I worked with the colleague that Paul mentioned, Sean Connor, on I believe the first Z-Dike type workshop in the state of Wyoming back in 2021 over near Lander. And yeah, this is just something near and dear to me. I think lots of potential here and lots of opportunity. Caleb asked me to talk just a little bit about degradation challenges in Wyoming. I think Paul's hit on those pretty well. But I'm going to go through just a few things that may be a little more closer to home for folks as far as what I've seen in my travels, and just hopefully highlight a few more things for people to pay attention to as they're traversing the landscape, what to look for, and then talk briefly about what's going on in the state to try to address them, but certainly lots more opportunity to do this. So let me see if I guess before I do that, I just want to throw out, I think Paul laid it out pretty well, but why do we worry about erosion and channelization? We take vacations to highly eroded landscapes. I was just recently in the Grand Canyon with my children, took this picture. It's a beautiful place, but I think for most of us in natural resources, it's pretty fundamental that erosion can cause problems. Paul laid it out as far as productivity and those types of things. But I just want to make the case that I think we need to sing it from the mountaintops, if you will. I don't think it's as fundamental as we like to think. I think the general public still may not understand that. Even though the Dust Bowl established my agency, I seem to feel like we tend to think it can't happen again. Those types of issues aren't real. And then also on these smaller ephemeral streams, I think a lot of the general public just doesn't care. They don't understand how important they really are. And so I think it's important that we try to educate ourselves, educate the public, and keep speaking the message and how big of an issue this is and will be. I'll get off my soapbox now, but I think it's important that people understand that our time here on Earth is pretty fleeting. We don't have 1 billion plus years to sit and wait for something beautiful to be created. And frankly, that we don't have the underlying geology in lots of Wyoming to make something like this. So, I guess, what does channelization do? Why are we concerned with it? I think Paul hit on this well. His water cycle graphic was much better than mine, but I feel like it's important to go back to elementary school, and the one on your screen now is more like what I was taught as a young man. But Paul talked about it pretty well. Basically, water falls from the sky, it gets intercepted somehow, it flows downhill either at the surface or subsurface, and eventually forms a stream, makes its way out to the ocean, and the whole process starts over again. So, why does it really matter? As he mentioned, it's a closed system. We're always working with the same amount of water. We're not going to lose water through this process. But basically what happens with as he described, with channelization, is that whole process is sped up. In my very simple mind, the water table lowers. Water that is subsurface is exposed to the surface. Generally narrows the hydrology, increases the energy, as he described, which then causes sedimentation issues, other issues that exacerbates the problem. It's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy, just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And there's all kinds of associated impacts. And as a wildlife biologist, that's really what I'm concerned with, the associated impacts. You get increased sedimentation in streams, you have issues for aquatic organisms, and then certainly as you get down cutting and those types of things, the value for terrestrial species is impacted as well. Lower productivity type things, less green areas, shorter hydro period, all those types of things that Paul talked about. Ultimately, we're decreasing the water availability in that rooting zone that's so important for vegetation, especially in the arid West. So why not just focus on the big issues and big streams? I think as humans, we tend to chase the ambulance, if you will, on any issue. We look for the big issues. We're kind of a triage-based organism, where that's where we're going to focus our attention, and we maybe eventually just kind of lose sight of the smaller underlying issues, whether that's our own health or in this case the landscape health. But I'm going to make the case to you that, especially in the arid West and in the a part of the country with quite a bit of topographic relief and thus lots of small watersheds, we need to be paying attention to these smaller order streams, these ephemeral draws that may not even have ever had water year round, just because of the sheer magnitude of them on the landscape here. This map, I think, does a pretty good job of illustrating the number of small order drainages in a traditional watershed in the West. And so if we're only focused on those larger order, stream order 4 or larger type streams, we're missing a lot of the landscape, and a lot of those small draws have huge impacts on agriculture and wildlife. And so I hope you take that to heart, and don't just focus on these downstream streams that have maybe blue ribbon fisheries and those types of things, but focus on the uphill things that have there are a ton of them and have a huge benefit to wildlife. Yeah, in general, I mean, I think it's important that these very small streams they're very small on the landscape, but they're very mighty, as I say here. They have a disproportionate value not only to wildlife, but also to agriculture, stream quality downstream, all of those types of things. They're truly little ribbons in the landscape. They produce fairly diverse and unique vegetation on the landscape. These are places where species grow that can't make it in that rough, arid environment surrounding them. And they tend to provide green groceries later in the year that are very important for certain species. Paul mentioned Gunnison sage grouse starting this work. And yeah, those types of species flock to these areas literally in late summer for brood rearing, where there's insects, there's green groceries, all of those types of things that are very important for a small chick trying to get a high protein diet. And then, yeah, beyond that, Paul talked about elk, beavers, those types of things. They're drawn to these areas as well, whether that's because of willows, some of their vegetation, or just something green to eat, water to drink, those types of things. So, yeah, please don't lose sight of the little guy. As I mentioned, these areas are very disproportionately important, especially from a wildlife standpoint. This is a publication my agency produced a few years ago, along with somebody asked about the Roots poster that Paul presented. That's also on our website. You can go download that if you like. But a very, very, very small percentage of the overall landscape in the West. It's estimated about 2 to 3%. But a huge percentage of the region's wildlife are dependent on these areas. 75%, 75 to 80% is what you routinely see in the literature. I've seen even higher values for the state of Wyoming. Upwards of 90% of the region's wildlife are dependent on these areas at some point in their life cycle. And then, yeah, just hugely productive compared to arid rangelands around them. Much of the Wyoming range, if you're a range guy, you're talking about 0.2 AUMs to the acre or thereabouts. Lots of these areas will be well over 1 AUM to the acre if you're just talking about pounds of forage and those types of things. But also that increase in diversity, I think, from a wildlife standpoint, is very important. These produce species that can't make it in the uplands. You get greater vertical diversity with shrubs and trees and those types of things potentially that you don't have elsewhere. And then again, just better nutritional value from that green area, higher protein, those types of things. So now I'm going to move on just briefly to some common sources of degradation that I've seen in Wyoming. This is going to be a little bit overlap to some of Paul's stuff, but hopefully that's okay. I kind of break these down into a few main categories. Water impoundments here, I'm mainly talking about dams and diversions, those types of things. Ag-related issues, irrigation, cropping. I know generally in this workshop, we're going to be talking about rangelands, arid rangelands, and associated perennial and ephemeral streams, but I think there's some nice correlations to irrigation and cropping, and some overall natural events and how that can impact things and how we may or may not be making that worse. And then probably the biggie in my mind that Paul hit on a bit is transportation networks, historic and current, I think, cause lots of issues for us and should be something we pay attention to when we're on the landscape and or looking at things on maps like Paul just showed you. So water impoundments, hopefully none of us are dealing with the situation in the upper left there. That was kind of just some shock and awe to throw in there. Certainly that would have huge ramifications for erosion downstream, probably loss of life and property as well. So hopefully we're not dealing with those. But it is important to understand the impact of large reservoirs on adjacent drainages. Based on the base elevation that they set that dam at, the whole system then has to reach a new equilibrium potentially. It's been estimated that some of the large dams and reservoirs on the Colorado River have impacted stream elevations up to 15 miles away from the actual reservoir. And I've heard not quite that big a number, but for some of the bigger reservoirs in Wyoming, like Pathfinder and Seminole, several 3, 4, 5 miles away, they've seen adjustments to streams, and that has impacts to adjacent wetlands that were supported by those as well. So not necessarily, I'm not advocating for removing reservoirs, just be aware of their impacts and how that might be impacting the systems you're working on. But mainly what we're talking about with this workshop is kind of that upper right and center of your screen, small stock dams. There was thousands of these built 50 to 100 years ago in the state of Wyoming, and almost none of them were built to modern engineering specifications. Almost none of them have an emergency spillway. They probably don't have proper compaction, or what we would consider proper compaction today. Maybe they don't have any sort of armoring on the actual slope. Those types of things. And then just generally, they probably exceeded their lifespan, even if they were a modern engineered structure. Things just eventually wear out, right? But what we see because of this is almost all of those structures today, or many of them, if they haven't been properly maintained or improved, we often see some sort of head cut going through the main outlet structure or just right over the main spillway. And this, again, causes that system to unravel upstream, downstream of those small water sources. And then when you actually do get runoff coming into them, the whole system just kind of continues to move up and downstream. The other issue with stock dams is that they tend, like any water source, they tend to be an area of concentration for livestock. So there in the bottom of your screen, you see, livestock, cattle congregating around them. That's not necessarily a bad thing, other than it can potentially, for this workshop, lead to compaction of the soil, trailing, those types of things that can cause water to speed up, as Paul talked about. If you compact the soil, it's no longer able to infiltrate as well. And then if you get trailing right along the drainage, again, you're compacting it, you're making that water go faster, make it more easily to speed up, cut down, those types of things. In addition, that can also lead to areas of heavy livestock use. So the vegetation is less than you might have historically seen. And so the vegetation is less able to intercept precipitation, less able to intercept runoff. And the rooting zone becomes less as plants get stressed. They reduce the size of their root structure. And so suddenly the soil is less able to hold together. So pay attention to those areas. I've literally been on ranches in central Wyoming where every drainage on the ranch has an old stock dam that is blown out, and then every one of those drainages today now has a head cut moving up it. Ag-related issues. I always say I'm a recovering Midwesterner myself, and so these are pictures that I'm fairly familiar with. In irrigated country and parts in the Midwest and East where it actually rains, there's lots of instances where people have altered stream courses to straighten out fields, those types of things. And again, what this does is cause water to speed up. It decreases the length of the stream we're dealing with, and then those have associated impacts to the surrounding landscape. You don't see this too much in Wyoming, but we do certainly see a few places in rangeland and in areas adjacent to cropland where we do see streams that have been straightened to some degree to make a transportation corridor fit in or whatever, make a field boundary work. And so look for adjacent erosion tied to those systems. And then there on the right of your screen, that's an actual drainage ditch in the middle of a field in the eastern United States, where the intent is to lower that water table. There's actually drainage equations and everything you can pull up for that part of the world based on the precipitation and the underlying soils as far as how much area that drainage ditch will actually drain. Again, people generally aren't doing this activity in the arid West where they're trying to save every drop they can get. But similar things can happen with historic ditches. There's plenty of places in eastern Wyoming where hard up pioneers tried to farm lots of acres that we would today say is probably very, very marginal cropland. They've abandoned those, but the ditches may still remain. And so those areas can be de facto drainage ditches on the landscape. We also see areas where they built what they called spreader dikes, and essentially, if those were dikes to try to spread out runoff at the time, and some of those were built where they're actually below the general surface grade, and again, that's causing somewhat of a de facto drainage system. And if they're not created properly, if they're not well vegetated, all of those can also become sources of head cutting upstream of them when they're unprotected and exposed and receive runoff. So keep an eye out for that. Probably something you're not going to see a ton of in Wyoming, but I think the general concepts apply. And as a guy that deals with wetland compliance a lot, this hits home for me. Natural events, yeah. Paul hit on this well, talking about bankful benches, normal high water marks, those types of things. Certainly drainage ditches are naturally formed by natural events. And so we're not trying to control that, but there is a natural range of variability within those systems that they should be somewhat close to. Paul talked about, hitting bankful bench flows basically every 2 years. We have lots of systems in the West today that, as he described, may never hit bankful bench anymore, or if it is, it's on a much more irregular basis every 10, 20, 30 years. And so those systems in their new floodplain, really get to banging around, causing issues and generally unraveling because they can't get rid of the energy they have within them anymore. We've likely exacerbated this issue, whether it's climate change or not. We've done large scale fire suppression efforts across the West for many, many years. Those cause other issues as well. When fires do occur now, they tend to be bigger, stronger, hotter, and those can lead to hydrophobic soils that are no longer able to create any infiltration. And so when we do get precipitation events on top of those fires, it runs off much more quickly. Again, you get higher speed, higher velocities, higher energy that causes down-cutting. You get more runoff, which can silt up drainages and then cause basically new drainages to be formed. And then there's pretty good evidence that precipitation patterns are also changing across the United States and in this area in particular, whereby, we may be receiving similar amounts of precipitation, but more of it's likely coming as rain or it's more of it's coming in large events, interspersed with longer periods of drought. So when you have longer droughts, you have vegetation that is stressed. Again, their root structure becomes less as they're able to devote less resources to those roots. And then when you do have a big precipitation event, that can lead to faster runoff because those plants and the adjacent soils are less able to take them off, comes off faster, which can then cause greater cutting because again, there's just more energy in that system. Not much we can do about that, I guess, in our lifetimes probably, but it's just something to be aware of. And then also, I think the main thing we should be trying to do as practitioners is just build resistance and resilience into that system as best we can. Do whatever we can to make sure those systems can handle that level of stochasticity and with good vegetation, good management, those types of things, and or maybe some of these structures to help them hold together through ever greater events. Finally, I guess transportation networks. Paul hit on this well. Had some nice pictures. but yeah, certainly he talked about wagon trails, and I'll talk about that real briefly. But modern transportation, unfortunately, we haven't learned. We've learned some things, but we do often repeat the errors of our predecessors. We see lots of roads that aren't properly designed. We see water crossings that aren't properly protected, and so they just keep silting up, keep cutting down, and or people just keep moving them to make them work without actually addressing the real problem. Even just 2-track roads, heavy cow trails, again, those are areas of compaction that speed up water flow, those types of things. And often when you walk along them for a decent stretch, you'll see some sort of head cut moving up from them at some point. We as modern humans, we have big machinery with big engines and the ability to go most places. And for whatever reason, we like to go most everywhere in a vehicle. And so we build roads or create roads in areas that, the slope's too great. It's going to create fast runoff, cutting, those types of things. You see that lower left picture, but certainly I think there's lots of instances of this with new UTV trails, ATV trails, and you see that cut forming down the middle of that road and then running off. Obviously, that's going to cause issues elsewhere, and unfortunately, oftentimes we just keep patching it back together and not addressing the overlying issue. Improper drainage. Again, this isn't probably a huge deal in lots of arid Western places, but when we do have a set drainage feature, whether that's tied to a bridge or otherwise, if that culvert is not set correctly, that's an immediate source of head cutting and can create all kinds of other issues with fish passage, aquatic organism passage, those types of things that we're not going to dwell on in this training. But yeah, certainly pay attention to those areas. Properly sized culverts and or maybe bottomless culverts can be a much better option if you run into those situations. And yeah, it needs to be professionally designed to hold together. It shouldn't just be some random guy throwing a culvert in there and saying, yeah, it's good enough. They should be looking at the flow patterns of that drainage, what high flow events, those types of things to make sure it doesn't unravel. And then there in the lower right, it's clearly a situation where that didn't occur. And this one was created by a railroad grade. Again, that's a common area of degradation I see. Lots of these railroads were built hundreds of years ago, may not have been properly designed for drainage and those types of things. And the railroad or whoever just keeps kind of patching them back together to keep them whole. And then just to tie in with Paul's, I don't have any great pictures of modern day wagon trains, but I was just recently out on this property. It's got some great relics of the Oregon Trail. You can see some nice swales here right in the middle of your screen, a little less so here on the lower left. But yeah, again, we can't go back and teach these people proper road design. They probably wouldn't have done it anyway. But if you notice these patterns, again, if you walk any sort of distance along them, you'll often see what you see there on the right. This is a head cut coming up out of that wagon train, that Oregon Trail site. And so certainly has impacts to the surrounding landscape. And then, yeah, within the swale itself, I'm sure that water speeding up, going downhill. In this case, it's largely intercepted by a crop field, so maybe not doing quite as much damage at this point, but certainly could. And yeah, this is, hundreds of years old. It will be here for hundreds of years. And those things are going to have long-term impacts. And yeah, certainly Wyoming was traversed by lots of wagon trains, lots of stagecoaches, stage lines. And so pay attention to those things as you're out on the landscape and or looking at old maps, as Paul so eloquently showed. So what do we do about it? I think that's what this whole training is about. It's what most folks are wanting to learn about. I would just say that traditional approaches really target that triage situation. We like to work in big streams with big equipment and do big things. And there's certainly a place for that. Those projects are cool. My agency's involved in lots of them, but they're very, very, very expensive. Depending on the order of stream, I mean, you can easily be dumping $500,000 per mile on to address some issues on downstream large streams. As you get bigger with more velocity, more quantity of water, the material just has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the equipment you use has to correspond to that. These are also higher risk areas, so I got the engineering stamp there at the bottom, but yeah, you really need professionals to be working with you on these situations, and that also drives up the expense, the risk, the insurance needs, all those types of things. So in my opinion, these are kind of hard to scale, so you really need to be strategic about where you're doing these in areas that have high value for whatever resource. Not that we should go away with them, it's just I don't think it's practical to use this approach everywhere. The good news is some of the stuff that Paul's going to be talking to you about today is really gaining momentum. I've just got a kind of litany of slides here from some projects I'm familiar with and have been on site on across Wyoming. You got some stuff represented here from around Pinedale, Wyoming, down towards South Pass, Wyoming, Bill, Wyoming, and then some stuff in Carbon County as well. People are interested in this stuff. They're taking action. They're getting things done and showing some really cool results in the process. These are neat projects and have huge environmental benefits, and I really hope they continue to gain momentum. The bad news is it's a very target-rich environment. As I mentioned, I think you'd be hard-pressed to step foot on a ranch in Wyoming and not find an area where you could apply these practices. So until we really staff up or whatever, I think some level of strategy might be needed to try to target those areas where you're going to actually have the most benefit. But suffice it to say, there's plenty of work to be done. There's a need for more groups that are interested in doing this type of work, and I really hope it continues to grow. On your screen is just kind of a general map of projects I know about in Wyoming. I'm likely missing some. The green stars are areas where kind of some of these rock structures, Z-dike structures have been employed. The yellow stuff is some of the more, I guess, beaver dam analog, post-line wicker weave, whatever you'd like to call it, type stuff has been done. That's really not the focus of this training, but similar approaches just in more perennial systems is the focus there. So quite a bit going on, but you can see some pretty big holes there. And then you can also just see that, yeah, even where we are working, there could be much more done. So go forth, do good things. If you need some more resources, here's some from the NRCS. Those, I assume these slides will be made available. Those are hot links to our actual sites, but you can just Google them as well. There's some great resources there, and I'm sure Paul will be providing you some others. NRCS can and does assist with these practices, both technically and financially. There's our practice code for this, Practice 643, Restoration of Rare and Declining Natural Communities. So feel free to engage us if that would be helpful. But certainly there's room for other organizations as well. And then, yeah, if you have other questions or whatever, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll try to assist as best I can.
All right.
With that, Caleb, I think I am done, and I will turn it back to you.
Yeah, I just want to thank Brian and Paul for your presentations, and thank everybody for jumping on. We are going to try to jump to a different meeting so that we have better interaction with our attendees. We wanted to have everybody introduce themselves, and that way it kind of helps us know our audience a little bit better and have a little more interaction on the Q&A. These virtual presentations aren't as good as in person, and so we're trying to do what we can there, and we definitely want to have some question and answer and that interactive component of this. So let's go ahead and take our break, and what we're going to do is have you, the easiest way to do this is to have everybody click the link in the Q&A. If you click on your Q&A button and scroll down to the bottom of that, Aaron put a link in there for a new meeting, and that will allow you to register and open up that new meeting. I'm going to stay in here just in case people have problems with that or whatever. And so yeah, that link is there. And we should be able to click on that and you should be able to get over to the new meeting. So let's go ahead and do that and jump over there, and we'll have a Q&A session with Paul and Brian to answer anybody's questions about this topics that they've discussed thus far. And then we will jump into our next presentation with Paul on structure types and building material options. So we'll start talking more in depth about how we can address these challenges. We'll talk about monitoring and maintenance. And then Paul's also going to share a little bit on remote analysis techniques as well. And some of those techniques that he's able to use in being able to identify some of these areas remotely and using some of the technologies that we have available. And then we'll have another Q&A to follow that. So let's take about 10 minutes and we'll try to jump back in here about 10:20, maybe a little bit before that. And yeah, and we'll reconvene and we'll get your questions answered and keep moving on. So thanks everybody for joining us, and have some patience as we navigate some of the technology that we're dealing with here, and we'll get some good interaction going here. So.
The information I'm going to go over is included in that page, that the link that Brian just sent out. There, I'll be referencing it's an NRCS technical publication 40 out of Colorado. There's a bunch of information. Much of the information that I'm going to go over in this next section is included in that document, and so you can download that. And I would encourage you to do that before the workshop in May, because there's a lot of really good information in there. It's well written, and it's free. So with that, I think I will jump into the next section on structure types and building material options. So let's see. You guys can see my screen?
Looks good.
All right. Yeah, so I break structure types down into three broad categories: protection, stabilization, and restoration. And you know, as Brian mentioned, head cuts quite a bit, and this is a picture of a head cut that is chewing its way up into this wet meadow, and the spring is up here where these willows are. Trying to rebuild something like this is always much more difficult than protecting what you already have. And so for me, whenever I look at a project, the first priority is to identify those important wet meadow habitats and then to protect them. Once we have those head cuts stabilized and we're protecting those wet meadows, then we can start looking at restoration. And so they're different structures for different types. So this is a great example of a stabilization structure. This is a low water crossing. Basically it's taking, this is a road on the BLM, and you know, when the hunters cross it in the fall, it gets all boggy, and so then they jump over here to the left and it get boggy and they jump to the right, and basically we're taking what is it should be a nice gentle sloping meadow and turning it into a bog by stabilizing it with this structure. We're preventing further degradation. And then finally, beaver mimicry. This is a wicker weir that is intercepting some flow in a channel and kicking it out onto the floodplain to the valley right. So what we're doing is restoring, using a structure to spread water across the surface of the entire floodplain. There are different objectives potentially for your project, and you want to know what those are before you start designing structures. Typically, what we're looking at from a wet meadows perspective is restoring floodplain connectivity. We're re-wetting that sponge. What we want to do, if we do it correctly, we hope that we can have longer base flows in that system. We hope that our water temperatures can come down. We also look at improving water quality. But you might also use these same techniques especially here in Wyoming after last year, these techniques are great for post-fire rehabilitation. And all of the same techniques, all of the same structures can apply in that setting. And then it may be that you want to modify either behavior of humans or wildlife or livestock in the event of trailing, or like I just showed you, that low water crossing. So these are the different objectives that you might have within your project. But ultimately, all of these process-based wet meadow restoration projects, the Z-Dike style projects, and even some of the beaver mimicry stuff that we do, their sole purpose is to slow water down. We want to spread it out and slow it down. So again, we've got the stabilization style structures. We've got grade control structures. So the stabilization are our head cut protections. Grade control structures are going to be ones that we place in the channel to grade the channel bottom. They're typically erosion control structures that help lift that channel up so we have more and more frequent inundation of the floodplain. We have flow dispersal. Once we're on the floodplain, we may have flow dispersal structures to make sure that we're getting a good even wetting across there. And again, we have behavioral style structures. So for head cut stabilizations, we basically have three basic ones that we typically look at. We've got a rock rundown, a rock layback, and a Zuni bowl. Head cuts move in two ways. I'll go back to this previous slide. The way that we think about normally is the mechanical action of falling water, this gravitationally induced speeding up of water, the high energy as it hits the soil underneath the base of the head cut, and it just basically scours out a pool, and then the head cut falls into the pool. When we have water in these systems, that's the way these head cuts move rapidly. But a more insidious way that head cuts move, and they continue to move even in systems that don't get a lot of water, is the oxidation of the vegetation right at the edge of the head cut. And I love this photo, not because I love head cuts, but because it really shows how you can see the roots that are hanging down along the face of the head cut. And as those roots are exposed to the air, they dry out, they die, then the plants die, and all the soil that those roots are holding begin to collapse into these head cuts. So these head cuts, even though this pace is slow, you can still see there's 4 to 6 inches annually on the face of this head cut that's dying back. And without doing anything, even if there's no water in this system, this head cut will continue to migrate upstream at a rate of 4 to 6 inches a year. And so halting that kind of head cuts are pretty important. So what we're going to do is, one, we want to stabilize the head cut from mechanical action, and we also want to retain moisture on the face of the head cut. So our head cut structure is designed to do those two things: protect the bottom of the channel from excavating out, and then to basically mulch the face of the head cut itself. So again, a rock rundown, a rock mulch, and a rock rundown is exactly what it sounds like. What we're going to do is we're going to take the face of this head cut, and we're going to carve it back at a 3-to-1 slope. And then what we're going to do is you can interseed into that if you think it's necessary. But the first set of rocks that we put in is right down here, in this splash apron. And this is in all our structures, this is the most critical portion of the structure. It's the first piece we should put in. And what we want it to be is perfectly level with the bottom of the channel. That way, if we have it elevated above the channel, what's going to happen is it's going to spill off the face, and we're creating a mini head cut, and we're just going to start the process over. So we get this one set, and we get it keyed into the bottom of the channel, and then we start shingling back from that until we get up to the top of the structure. And then this one we set perfectly level with the top the channel. And this, again, serves two purposes. One, water sliding across the face of this gets broken up by the irregularity of all the rock that's in there. But the other thing, as kids, whenever we rolled over a rock in the summer, there was always a moist pocket underneath it. And there'd be roly-polies and all sorts of other stuff underneath those rocks. Rocks act as mulch. And so particularly if we've interseeded underneath it, those rocks are going to hold moisture in the soil, allow those seeds to germinate, and we can get, ultimately, this structure will disappear. It'll get buried in the grass and ultimately disappear. Again, all of these descriptions are included in that technical note, the range technical note that is in the link that Brian sent out just a moment ago. Another form of this is a rock layback, which is really similar, except you're using coarser rock, and they're more keyed in, and you're deliberately intercepting the flow and you have rather than it being kind of a shingled approach, you actually step it down with sets of different rows of different size rock. And then the Zuni bowl is used to address these big head cuts that are deep. And basically what it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bowl that's keyed into the head cut. They're large structures. People love these structures. They're the sexiest one in our arsenal. And Sean Connor, who built this one, is magnificent at building these things. They look like a water feature in somebody's backyard water feature. The way they're designed is basically we have a bowl that's filled with loose rock, but the walls of the bowl are stacked rows of rocks that are keyed back into the face of the structure. And we try to key them back in at a little bit of an angle because we know these structures are going to move a little bit. We're going to get water in the soil. And as these structures settle, we want them to settle back into the sides of the bowl. Then at the very front of the bowl, we have this row of rocks that forms a pool. Dropping water into still water, moving water falling into still water is one of the most effective ways of breaking that velocity energy relationship. And so the power of the Zuni bowl is the bowl itself forms this it forms this pool, that water pouring over the face. You can see the water sheeting off this rock and pouring into this bowl. It stills that. And so then the water coming out over this face just kind of slides out over. It speeds up a little bit as it drops onto the splash apron. But then we have a one rock dam immediately downstream that's capturing that energy and slowing it down. And again, building a shallow pool for this water to dissipate its energy in. The other, for bigger head cuts that get beyond what we can really address with a Zuni bowl, we use what's called a log fabric or a wood fabric structure. And these are big structures, as you can see. Again, Sean Connor built this one, a beautiful, beautiful structure. And what we do is we over excavate the site so that we can key logs back into the face, because again, we want to keep that face moist. So we want those logs sucked all the way back into the face of it. Before we set our logs, we lay down a strip of geotextile fabric that runs along the bottom of the stream channel up over the back of the cut, and then we lay down a second piece of geotextile fabric that comes across both sides. And we want it to be long enough to lay back up onto the sides of the cut that we've made. We install the logs. When he started, we didn't have access to cordless drills like we do today. And so he wires and staples wiring to it, and then we got to anchor these down. And this is something that's really, really critical. These have got to be well anchored. Typically, I use T-posts, and we can use cable, and we can cable those things in. But instead of using the wire, which is hard to get really tight, I use timber lock bolts. So bolts that commonly are used to build timber frame decks and things like that. You can buy them in different lengths, and depending on the size of the logs that you have, you can buy lengths that'll get you down through 1 or 2 layers of those logs. And with cordless, the cheap cordless drills that we have now, we can build these in the field really effectively. And when we bolt those things together, these structures get very, very stable. Once you get up to your top layer of rocks, you're going to flip that fabric back down onto the log itself, and then you're going to put in that last row of logs. And what you end up with is these big structures that water sheeting down into the irregularity of the wood starts to slow down, and then the fabric itself fills voids and captures sediment. They're very effective tools at addressing large head cuts. For grade control structures, in-channel grade control structures, the one rock dam is kind of the yeoman of the structures that you'll build the most. Obviously, there's more than one rock in this dam, but the reason it's called a one rock dam is that it's one rock high. The dams can be stacked in various ways. This one is called a book stack. You can see these rocks are set on edge. When you have material that you might have rocks that are longer than they are fat, you can book stack rocks on edge. The important thing there's a couple important things that you see here. One is we have our splash apron. That's the first piece that we put in, and it's the most important part of this. And then we have a ramp behind it, but what you'll notice too is that this is not flat going across the channel. It's not a check dam. It's a grade control structure. It is designed not to impound water, but to pass water. What we want it to do, water is sweeping down this channel. It hits this ramp of rocks on the upstream side and slows down, and then spills over this lower throat. So the outer edges of your one rock dam are always higher than your throat. This allows water to pass through the center of your channel, but you have nice still water back here that deposits sediment. This is a view of the same structure from the uphill side. You can see this ramp with how it is angled back from the back of the structure towards the front of the structure. You can see in this one, we've already got material that's been growing in through it. And here's the schematics on it. Again, our first step is putting in these footer rocks. Okay. As far as placement, we want these not in pools, but rather in riffles. So they're between our pools. And the idea is that we're using this riffle, this elevated area in the riffle, to capture sediment, and we're refilling sediment between these pools. Again, we want to have a smile. We don't want it to be flat across here. We want the throat so that it'll pass water. Let's see. A filter dam is very similar, but basically what Bill does with these is he incorporates geotextile fabric into the face of the structure and allows that to capture more sediment. Very often what he'll do is he'll also put a worm ditch in with this and kick water out along the ditch. But it's a very similar structure, but what we're doing is we're incorporating geotextile fabric into the face of that dam. And this can be very useful in streams where we have really fine particle size, streams that we have Mancos shale, or if we don't have really good rock, really good uniform rock that we can stack close together, you can incorporate geotextile fabric into that to reduce piping, which in these really fine sediment systems can cause your structures to settle and melt and open up. And so in some of these, incorporating geotextile fabric in can be a really powerful way of ensuring that those structures remain effective, even with the potential to pipe through them. Looking at flow dispersal, a very effective tool is the Media Luna, and right here you can see it says tips up. So this blue arrow represents flow coming down a channel. It intercepts this coarse, rocky half moon shape, and then what it does is that half moon shape allows water to spread across the valley bottom, so it's out of the channel. The way it looks in the schematic, we can build it in two ways: tips up or tips down. Some people call it a smile or a frown, or horns up, horns down. But basically, if you make it as a frown or horns down, what you're doing is you're taking sheet flow and collecting it into a single channel. And this can be very effective if we're dealing with culvert issues on a road. What we might want to do is capture that water in kind of the frowning, sorry, I'm losing my cursor again, the frowning system that focuses it into the culvert. And then as it comes out of the culvert on the other side, we can do the smile, and we can capture that and spread it back out onto the floodplain again. So this is a really effective tool for spreading water onto the floodplain once you've gotten it out of the channel. Wicker weir is similar to a BDA. I call them beaver mimicry. There's a couple of subtle differences with a wicker weir, though. What I find, we as humans love water, and we love to build ponds. But for wet meadows restoration, traditional BDAs don't really work very well in the long run. And so we modified those. Bill had always called them wicker weirs. He was building wicker weirs a long time ago. But basically, what you're doing is we're weaving vegetation between posts. And what we're trying to do is spread water laterally across the floodplain. But rather than building a big, deep pool, these are really short structures for wet meadow restoration. These are survey stakes, so they're 2-foot tall survey stakes, and you can see we've only built up behind them maybe 9 inches. Okay, these are short structures rather than really big, deep pools. What you have to think about is when you build a big BDA, you've got a 4-foot tall structure. If a pound or if a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds and you're storing 50 gallons of water, you've got a tremendous amount of weight on relatively small poles. And what you end up doing is most of the time how BDAs fail, in my experience, is that they fail along the bottom, and we get piping underneath, and then all of a sudden your structure drains. The difference between a BDA and a beaver dam is a beaver. And without constant maintenance, BDAs have a very short lifespan. With wet meadow restoration, we're looking for permanence. We're looking for something that's going to last a long time until vegetation, soil gets filled in and vegetated, and then we don't have to rely on the structure as much. And so we're going to modify these a little bit. One of the ways, well, first off, I like to build lots of really short structures rather than a single big structure. What you get then is incremental steps, and more importantly, these short structures are less vulnerable to loss due to high flows. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but a shorter structure will pass water faster and is less susceptible to blowing out than a taller structure. So this is one we built on a friend's property. Again, we were using 2-foot survey stakes. We were using willow. We were using rabbit brush, sagebrush, a whole bunch of things. We built a rock ramp down below it. We went away and we were going to come back about a month later. In the intervening time that we left, he had a flood on this property. And you can see here's the channel. My friend Mick is standing here. The base of the stadia rod is the high flow. This is how high the flow was. If we had a BDA in there, what would have happened? 2 things could have happened. If we had a 3-foot BDA in there, yes, we would have created a pond behind it, but we would have had so much pressure behind it that BDA would have blown out, and we probably would have cut into this bank. Instead, what happened is that little tiny BDA captured this much sediment in a single event. We graded this system taller than the structure. The structure was only about 9 inches tall. We graded over 1 foot of gravel behind that structure. This is what it looks like today. It's starting to veg in really well. But now this is a big, instead of being a single thread channel, this is now a big soggy gravel mat that we're starting to get willows colonizing into that structure. These arrows point to the top of all these stakes. So these little tiny short survey stakes held back this massive amount of gravel, because once that structure filled with rock, all of a sudden the water pressure was off of it, and the stream moved right over the top of it. And so again, lots of short little wicker weirs in a channel are some of the most effective grade control structures we can have. This is a picture, again, just showing you how these little tiny survey stakes can hold back a tremendous amount rather than building a big, tall BDA. The other way we modify them is in a system like this is a perennial system. It's a spring-driven system, so we don't have a big peak hydrograph. But when we built BDAs in here, they cut around the edges. And so what we did is we modified this structure, and we call it a rock core wicker weir. And moving away from dams, the word dams, because in Colorado, our water rights rules are very stringent. Water engineers see the word dam and they immediately think that we're impounding water. And so I'm moving away from things like BDAs and one rock dams because there are connotations with that some people misinterpret. This, again, is designed to pass water. This is not designed to impound water. What we did, the BDA just filled the channel. What we did is we keyed the BDA back into the banks. We cut back into the banks by about a foot, put in our posts and our weave, and then we lay in geotextile fabric, fill it with rocks, and then put sod on top. Now what we have is a very porous dam that passes water but filters sediment. So we get sedimentation up here, but we're passing water through and over the dam. The center of the dam is lower than the edges. Just like a one rock dam, the center is lower so that we'll pass water. What we're doing is we're bringing this grade control structure up to the bankful geometry that's appropriate for this channel, and water flows over the top of it and flows through the structure itself. The geotextile fabric and the rock provide solidity. The wicker weir provides filtration and flexibility. So this structure is both strong and flexible, but it filters material. This is a picture of them installing the fabric into that structure. The plug and spread is an equipment-built structure. I'm going to back up real quick. When we do these hand-built structures, we're really focused in systems that are less than 4 feet or less deep. With a plug and spread, we can get a 6 to 10. We can work in 6, maybe 10 foot deep systems. But the idea is that what we're going to do is we've got an old road that has captured the stream. And what we're going to do is instead of trying to regrade 4 to 6 feet of material, we're just going to simply plug the channel and we're going to kick. Our road is captured. Our system here, our original channel is over here. And what we can do is we can plug this and basically put the water back in this channel. To look at it from above, what we see is water coming down the channel. We take material out of what we call the bay. We build a plug, and the bay has a brim that's perfectly level that shoots water out across the historic floodplain rather than it being confined inside the channel. So this is a channel that we built a BDA on. These are 6-inch contour lines. This is the digitized channel that I have, and I'll explain how we can make these real briefly at the end of our presentation today. But what we did is we built this plug right here. We plugged the channel. So now the channel comes up here. Our bay is right here, and it spreads water out onto this contour swale. And we're able to take the water out of this confined channel and spread it across this little remnant wet meadow. The best way to look at that, well, here's a photo of it from the side. So this red line is the arroyo. Here's the bay, and you can see the plug is right here, and the water is sheeting out to the right. It's low energy because it's flat. It's a low gradient setting. And then instead of it being a pond, it's a bay. It shoots out. This is the contour swale, and we're re-wetting this. And this arroyo is no longer draining this meadow. The way it, so again, this is the same imagery, but or the same digitized channel, but this shows the infrared imagery. Infrared imagery, plants reflect infrared. The wetter they are, the redder they appear in this infrared imagery. And so I use NAPE infrared imagery a lot in my planning processes because it shows me where I may have connectivity. What I want you to notice is how bright and vibrant these willows that are all along the channel are, and how this former wet meadow is kind of pink. When we put in this plug and spread, suddenly we get a really, really vivid and rapid response. This infrared imagery was taken a year after this was put in. The other one was taken 2 years before. And notice the tone of the color of the willows is really similar to the tone of the color of the wet meadow. So we're effectively re-wetting this. These willows are still staying nice and wet because there's still groundwater coming back into this channel, but now we've re-wetted this little meadow. So it's a very powerful tool. Behavioral structures, we want to modify human behavior. Again, the low water crossing. And this is a dual purpose structure, right? It's stabilizing the meadow where people were driving across, but you can see how this structure, because what we do is we over excavate the road, we lay down geotextile fabric, and we lay in 4-inch crushed rock, 4-inch minus crushed rock. And what that provides is a permeable surface for water to flow through. You can see the water is confined to this channel, and it interacts with the rock on the road, and now it's spread out across this entire surface of the meadow. So it serves two purposes. We provide a stable road crossing so people don't keep driving through the wetland. They're driving over it, but it also spreads water across the meadow. The way it's built, like I said, is we over excavate, we lay down geotextile fabric, we put in this coarse cobble. You can build a county road on top of this. You could put geotextile fabric on top of it and then put road base and then road surface on top of it if you wanted to. And these are incredibly important structures. They can work really, really well. They're really underutilized, and they're something that are really simple to build. And typically, they're so effective, we find that we actually have to, we're notorious for undersizing them. We'll put it in, we'll say, yeah, this is where we think it should go. And we end up having to add about 30% to each one of them because inevitably we spread water so effectively through these things that we've undersized them. Drift fencing is another structure that we use quite frequently where we have trailing, where we have livestock and wildlife trailing. In this case, these are elk trails on a ranch outside of Grand Junction where it's a trophy management. It's a ranching for wildlife ranch. So the trophy elk hunting, high concentrations, lots of elk, and they're lazy because they don't get punched around much except during hunting season, and they just move back and forth up these drainages. And what we want, we don't mind them utilizing the drainages. We don't mind utilization, but what we want to do is break up this trailing. And so we put in these short reaches of fencing. This is a photograph of a meadow that's been restored with a drift fence. The old trail used to go up the bottom of the meadow. And now with this drift fence, the animals are walking along the edge up on this contour well out of the meadow bottom, and the meadow itself has started healing itself. They still get in here and utilize it. They graze in here just fine, but they're no longer walking up and down the meadow. And then I want to talk a little bit about materials because, you know, Bill Zedike's work is known. He's known for rock structures, big rock, fancy rock structures. But in places here in Wyoming, we don't have quick and ready access to rock. We can build structures out of brick. Okay, we could build similar structures out of wood. What's important is less what you build it out of, but how you design it and how you build it. We could build, you could build a series of, you could build this out of logs if you wanted to. Stepping down this big rock rundown, instead of using a rock rundown, you could use it, you could build it out of logs. The important thing is understand why you're building the structure and then figure out how you can use the materials that you have on hand. These are some bricks structures that we've utilized in the Thunder Basin because they couldn't get rock, and it was actually cheaper to buy bricks than it was to truck rocks in here. This is one that I built with Lynette Sutphin, just south of Buffalo. We did a hybrid structure. She had lots of really good cobble, but not structural rock. So we could use the cobbly rock in the bottom. She just went to Home Depot and bought a bunch of these bricks. And what was interesting was we had one structure. We handpicked a bunch of rocks. They were similar sized Zuni bowls. And what we did is we built one out of bricks and one out of rock. And we found that we could build the one out of bricks it took us, I think, 9 man-hours. And the rock one took us about 12 man-hours to build. So they're a little more efficient. So don't be afraid to utilize these things. And just remember, yeah, it doesn't look natural, but rock isn't natural in this setting either. And these things are filling with material, and over time, you're not even going to see them. If you do, you might just see a rim of the rocks up here periodically, or the bricks. Here's a giant one we built in the Thunder Basin using bricks because we had all of this water coming off these faces. And it was just so large trying to figure out how to build something with wood or a Zuni bowl. It just was impractical. And so we did basically just a big rock retaining wall, where the flow now comes across the face. What we're doing is we're keeping at least this whole face is now moist. We thought that the water would come down here. It turns out the valley bottom is here. This is an old livestock trail. This is not the main channel. Water has actually started coming down here. We're going to modify it. We're going to put in a catchment area here, and then we're going to put in a series of splash aprons down here and a one rock dam that captures material and backfills into it. So yes, wood is a very effective material. This is on the Trinchera Ranch down in the San Luis Valley. This is a debris dam, and this debris dam is holding back about 2 feet of sediment and is stabilizing the stream upstream. Now, the lifespan of wood is going to be shorter than rock, but as long as we're aware of that when we put it in, there's nothing wrong with using it. So we mimicked that. We had a head cut here. It's about an 18-inch head cut. And we built this little we put in a layer of concrete pavers underneath here, built a little 2-log, 1-rock dam. A week later, we had about an inch of rain, and now this head cut has been broken down into 2 9-foot head cuts and is stable. So now it's no longer migrating upstream. We could come back in and put another layer here and probably put another layer down here. And then what we'd have instead of a series of stair steps is a nice wedge coming down through here. But we could have built this out of rock, but we chose to build it out of logs because they have a lot of wood that they're using there. Another way of using vegetation, if there's a bunch of pinyon juniper removal projects in your neighborhood, use that material. Instead of lop and scattering it up on this hillside, scatter it down in here. We pack the stems and then all of the coarse vegetation down into this drainage. And as water comes through here, it filters through all these coarse, the coarse fibrous vegetation, and it's now starting to erode. All through this, we've captured now about a foot of sediment underneath these branches because it really slows our high flows down. And then, don't be afraid to combine things. You can make a hybrid structure out of wood and rock. Whatever you need to do, this is not, Betty Crocker's cookbook where if you deviate from the recipe, the cake is going to fall. This is really intuitive stuff. You can really be flexible in what you use for your structures. If you have broken concrete, you can use it. I wouldn't use car bodies or old tires or stacks of batteries, but I wouldn't be afraid to use material that's available to you. I talked to a rancher in South Dakota. He had a bunch of old telephone poles. They're not my desired choice, but he has them. They were on his property. Yeah, you can use them. The important thing is understand why you're putting them in the place that you want to. We're at 11 o'clock, so I'm going to try and move through these real quick. Are there any questions before I go on to the next section? Okay.
Yeah, hey Paul, if we could just take a minute, and I apologize for the confusion of jumping back and forth here. But yeah, if anybody has any questions that you would like to throw out right now, I think we could take a couple minutes here
Okay.
before we jump in. Feel free to raise your hand or throw it in the Q&A session if you want, and we can address them. Otherwise, we'll keep on moving. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything, Paul. So
yeah, that's how good we are.
Yep. You're getting it covered. So I think we keep on trucking.
All right. Well, I will jump into to the next. I'm going to move through these relatively fast. But again, if there are questions, and don't hesitate to reach out if you driving home and you think, oh, geez, I should have asked this. Feel free to reach out and email me, call me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Maintenance and monitoring are really important. These structures are real simple, but they can fail, and we expect some of them to fail. We're never going to be perfect. You want to monitor to, well, gauge success. We're watching this in this One Rock Dam. We're seeing tremendous. It's basically this whole bottom has now been colonized by wild rose, which is a great indicator that we're pushing our system to a more mesic system. Now we also have all this fibrous material to capture sediment. Yeah.
You're not sharing your screen right now.
Oh, goodness.
Yep. I think it dropped off somehow there.
Sorry. Thank you for that,
That's
Brian.
all right.
Okay. There. This is the starting monitoring. You see Todd pensively staring at this, wondering, what have we done? Anyway, so here's my One Rock Dam. This is the first time we had water through it, and this is what it looks like today. We've got this big mat of wild rose that's colonized this, both above and below. This structure is working great. It's spreading out. It's spreading water out, and we're getting great sedimentation. Now that we have this vegetation is the gold standard. This system is going to continue to degrade every time water moves through it. Here's a series of monitoring photos. This is pre-treatment. This is after the treatment. And you can see how this head cut was migrating up here, and now it's no longer migrating, and we're spreading water across this system. And then we'll look at this BDA here in a moment. This BDA right here is this BDA right here. And this is the way they looked 9 months after we installed the BDAs. We had about a foot of aggradation. We were pretty excited, but what we were noticing was, it's starting to cut around the edge. This is our flow path. And this is why we monitor. We came back, we took this photo in May, and by July this had cut, and we drained all of the aggradation that we had behind that. And so that's when we came back in and we built our first layer we keyed this material in back into the bank. And this was the first iteration of what we came up with, basically developing that rock core wicker weir. When the coarseness of this started to fail, when the coarseness of the vegetation we were using started to fail and started to pipe through here, that's when we went back in and we put in a second layer and built that, like I say, the rock core wicker weir. But the importance of going back and walking through these after you've had water is to figure out which assumptions you made that were right and which assumptions you made that were wrong. None of these is a failure. I look at these all as tested hypotheses. And if we go back and keep track of what we've done, why we've done it, and what we would change, we continue to evolve. And these structures should evolve. But you'll notice this is now a very hybridized structure. There's wood and rock, because both of them have strengths, both of them have weaknesses. Lynette Sutphin sent me these photos. This is one of the things to be aware of when we're working in these systems. These systems are dynamic. So this is the Falsa property. They just finished putting in these structures. They installed this game camera, and I think it was that night, correct?
Yeah, right.
Right after they installed the cameras, they had the house fire came through and burnt through the entire project, including burning down a bunch of the structures that we had put in, including an entire wood fabric structure. That's something that we just have to be aware of. But on the other hand, these structures are still in place. And actually, we're going to go out there and look today, but some recent photographs she sent me, most of these structures have filled. They went back in and immediately rebuilt, rewove these structures. And now most of these structures are 2/3, 3/4 of the way full of sediment. And that sediment's full of ash and phosphorus and nitrogen. My guess is going to be that this system, this portion of this drainage, while we don't have as much sagebrush, and which that's going to be a problem from a nesting habitat perspective, we're going to have phenomenal brooding habitat in here this spring. Because these, rather than this arroyo running upstream, we're now filling every one of these head cuts with really rich organic material laden soil. So yeah, monitoring is important. Maintenance is important. This was a head cut. The first workshop I did up here in Buffalo, this is Zach Byram. We found this head cut where you're like, yeah, let's build a structure. We built this big rock rundown and it was great. We had a big storm that ran through here. And so we built the structure. That night we had a rainstorm that filled the structure, and literally we filled this one rock dam with mud. And I'm thinking, man, I am really good at this. Look how this thing's absolutely bomber, and it's filling. I'm going to take people back here again and again. We went back the year later because we were getting ready for another workshop, the one with Lynette. And look, it's still working. This is great. This was we went back. This was the following year. We wanted to take a look at it. The year after that, we went back to look at it with Lynette, and it had blown out. So these things can fail. What happened was I didn't realize I built a rock rundown in an emergency spillway for a stock pond. And, when I went out there, the stock pond didn't have much water in it. So it didn't register on me that I was actually working in their emergency spillway. And this was the exact wrong structure to put in there. We should have put in a wood fabric structure, and it probably would have survived because there were 2 little wood fabric structures upstream that did survive. All our rock structures moved. So it's important that you go back and look at these things. These are not a one and done treatment. These are iterative treatments that we go back to every few years. And once one layer is full, we put in a second layer. But that means we have to constantly go back and rebuild and maintain these things. So we will have failure. But the beautiful thing is all the rock is sitting right down here. We didn't lose it. And the head cut didn't migrate any further upstream. So while the structure failed, we didn't have head cut failure and we didn't lose more ground. We just need to build the appropriate structure in that particular site. I want to talk real briefly, because we've got about 15 minutes left, on some things that are available to us. We can do a tremendous amount now with digital mapping. And I rely on this really heavily, particularly when Caleb calls me up and says, hey, I want you to look at a site. And I can look at it in my office in Gunnison. And then when we go out in the site, he and I can literally walk to head cuts. So there's a lot of information that's available. I really encourage you guys to go to the USGS website. They have LiDAR Explorer, and we now have 1 meter LiDAR data for almost all of the United States. And everywhere I've been in Wyoming, all the places I work in Colorado, we got 10 and 1 meter LiDAR data. With 1 meter LiDAR data, you can digitize, you can actually create flow paths, and you can digitize your channels, make longitudinal profiles. And we're finding head cuts as short as 4 inches. We're able to map head cuts as short as 4 inches. I typically don't work with head cuts that small, but 6 inch head cuts, we can identify really, really accurately. And so 1 meter LiDAR data is really, really powerful data. So I would encourage you guys, if you have any GIS background, start playing with this LiDAR data. You're going to be able to do things and pre-map things that give you a level of efficiency in the field. You're going to see things that you can't see with the naked eye. For example, this is an example of a map from a project on the Trinchera Ranch. These are 6-inch contours that I built, and you can literally see. You can literally see head cuts, and you can design structures before you ever go into the field and verify them. And it's incredibly powerful stuff. This allows you to build a much more accurate budget, because you can say, all right, this particular reach is going to require 13 structures. I know that, I know from the LiDAR data that this is the approximate size. Pad that a little bit, add 25%. You're probably going to have more material than you need. And at least then you have the ability now to, instead of getting a budget and then trying to figure out how to shoehorn that into your structures, if you have this LiDAR data, you can preload what you need into your grant applications. Stream stats, I've mentioned it several times, in conjunction with LiDAR data is absolutely imperative. That's what this is, again, for the Trinchera Ranch. You get in Colorado, there's a little bit more data just because we have some more data points, but you get basin characteristics that give you everything from slope and elevations to different veg types, gives you annual precipitation. In some cases, you can get parts of your runoff curves. You can get flood flow information, depending on where you are. But again, what I get is I really like these flow duration parameters, and then the bank full. In Colorado, we're able to actually, you can build little hydrographs for some of these tributaries, and then the bankful statistics. I use the bankful statistics all the time, and it's what allows me to build these kinds of graphs. So here's the blue line is our LiDAR derived topography of the existing. This orange line is the modeled bankful geometry for this site, which is this Zuni Bowl right here. So with the LiDAR data, with stream stats, I'm able to build. Now I know what my bank full elevation should be. This allows me to figure out how tall I want to build my structures. It gives us a level of power for planning that we haven't had before. And I'm not the most adept person with GIS. I'm pretty clumsy with it, but there's a lot of YouTube videos that walk you through how to do this stuff. And I really encourage you guys to take a look at it. And again, USGS has phenomenal stuff. The other thing they have is their Topo Explorer. And that's where I got those old historic maps for the Yellowstone area. And I find them useful because a lot of times the modern maps don't have the old Prosser homestead or whatever. So sometimes you can see things on these older maps. You might have some older trails and roads that don't occur on the more modern maps. But they'll give you can literally look at every map that the USGS has in their archives for specific areas. So that's another powerful tool that I use in my preliminary work. NRCF NAPE imagery is fantastic, and this web address, and again, Caleb, I think you have the slide presentations, and please feel free to plagiarize anything in these. I plagiarize from my coworkers as well, so please go ahead and if you want to follow these as hot links, they'll take you right to these sources, these sites. But you can, this is, you can get both the color imagery and infrared imagery, and both of them can be really useful. And the nice thing is we're starting to get a whole series of of imagery, so you can go back in time and look at some of these sites, and you can actually, the resolution's getting high enough, you can actually map changes in head cuts in some cases with this imagery. Super powerful. It's all public federal information, and it's readily available online. So use it. And that's the last of what I have. I was able to squeak us in with about 12 minutes. Is that good, Caleb?
Yeah, that's good. Yep. And yeah, so if you guys have some questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll bring you up and try to get those answered. Autumn did request if you could put the link to the USGS resources in the chat if you have access to that right now, or if not, if you send it to me, we can throw it out there later too. But we can, if we got any questions for either Paul or Brian related to the topics we discussed today, feel free to throw them out there. So we've got some time to address those.
Oops. Yeah. All right. Now.
Oh, there's a question in the chat related to geotextile.
Let's see. I use whatever I can get. Typically it depends on what where I'm working and what is available in the area that I'm working. A lot of times, especially if I'm working with a contractor that is they have stuff on hand. But I have not used biodegradable materials. I don't know why they wouldn't work. I just haven't used them to date. Typically, I don't remember each company has a different brand name, but basically, I look for the stuff that they're using for road base. If they're putting it in underneath a road, that kind of stuff. That it's fairly durable. The kind of fabric that they use, say, in a stream restoration project.
Yeah, the question about that, Paul. A lot of the conservation districts across the state do have pretty heavy duty landscape fabric that they use for like tree rows and things like that. I know we try to keep some on hand here, so that might be another option. If you're looking for some, you might reach out to the conservation district wherever you're working at and see if you're able to get some from them. We get it in 300 and 500 foot rolls, and they're usually 6 foot wide. And so, and it's pretty heavy duty stuff. So that could be another option too. And there's a lot of companies, even Home Depot sells it now, and you can buy it in the BioGo roll or various sizes as well. So just the most important thing, I think, is just looking at a heavy duty option. So, but did you see that next question there, Paul?
Yeah. Delaney, excellent question. Yeah, 4 inches, it's kind of an arbitrary thing, but typically what I see, those ones can kind of come and go. I keep an eye on them. I will work in a 4-inch head cut if it's in a series of 3. If we're seeing we have bigger head cuts immediately upstream, I will address them. Typically, when they're that small, a lot of times they'll heal on their own. If we're working in that system. If I am going to work on it, usually all I do with a 4-inch head cut is usually a rock mulch. I mean, I guess it's hard to have these hard and fast rules. If it's a 4-inch head cut, but it spans the entire valley bottom, that's one I would address. But if it's a 4-inch head cut that's only 8 inches wide, that I'm not really worried about. So, I guess it's kind of an intuitive feel that you develop. The next question I see is about plant regrowth using pavers versus natural materials. That's something that we've discussed, and it's something that we're trying to tease out. We're just starting to use some of these engineered materials, so I don't have an answer to that yet. But what we've decided to do, like in the Zuni bowls, instead of just leaving those pavers whole, what we're doing is we go in with a sledgehammer afterwards and we shatter them so that they have cracks. And was actually out at the Thunder Basin yesterday looking at some of those treatments, and we're starting to get western wheatgrass coming up through the bottoms of those structures. Ideally, that bowl we wouldn't be using pavers in there, but it's just what we could get in there at the time. We did not have access to other material that was affordable. But I think that's a really important question, and it's one that we're watching. But we can get at the same thing by breaking up those pavers.
Yeah, Paul, I remember having those discussions while we were building some of those structures last year. A lot of those people brought up that same concern, and it'll be interesting over time to see some of the differences as we incorporate, some of these pavers that are a little more uniform. And I'm really liking some of these hybrid structures where we're using rock and pavers together as to kind of make an apron with the pavers, or maybe across the top, too, where you're trying to tie it in and key it in with the top of the head cut, and then using the rock as a more variable substance too. So going to be really interesting to see that. And I was thinking too, Paul, back on that question that was asked earlier about the smaller head cuts. And I have a picture that I took here of our walk through of the project site on Sunday, if you want me to share that.
Yeah.
And I thought one of the things that you and I had talked about was maybe in some of these areas, rather than targeting the head cuts themselves, maybe trying to mitigate the cause of some of the erosion and stuff in that area, whether it's trailing or what, And so did you want to talk a little bit about our conversation on that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the site that we're going to is really fascinating because we struggled to find some head cuts I struggled to find them using my digital imagery, and I was like, oh boy, I wonder what's going on here. And what we're seeing is I think we're looking at a system that is it had been degraded, but with the change in management over a number of years, the system is starting to heal itself. And there were a number of head cuts that would have probably been 6-8 inch head cuts several years ago that now they've leaned themselves back. They're fully vegetated, and they aren't really being super detrimental. And really the only thing in most of these things was some trailing, the animals moving up and down these valleys, and just with strategically placing some drift fences, I think will do as much as or more than simply getting in there and putting in a lot of rock and structure into it. I think that some of the issues that are there, that where we're going to work, we did find a drainage with a lot of some big head cuts and a lot of stuff. So don't worry, we're going to have plenty of project work for you guys in May. That one, we're trying to figure out though, why in this one drainage on the same piece of property do we have such dramatic differences? And it's I think one of the beautiful things about this is we never stop learning. Did that kind of get to your comments there?
Yeah, I think so. And just maybe one of the comments you and I talked about was adding drift fence in this particular drainage where this picture is taken, because we found a handful of these small head cuts And the curiosity that we had was if you were to put in drift fence and alter that path of the livestock trailing up and down through here, if some of those would heal themselves without having to necessarily go in and address each one of them individually. And again, I guess you just have to put it up there and kind of see what happens. But based on some of the other sites on this project, like Paul said, I would be really curious to see if just a small disruption of that pattern in that of accessing this drainage here, if that would be enough to make it start to heal. And again, that could be unique to this site, and maybe it wouldn't work in this drainage like it did some of the others. It's one of those things where you might just have to try it and see what happens. So
Yeah.
but
Casey asked how frequently are we monitoring or maintaining structures, and that really, I mean, that depends depends on a lot of things. I like to get out. I mean, I like to get out and look at these structures when there's water pouring through them, but I'm in Gunnison, so I get out to some of these sites maybe once a year. Though Dave Pellets down in the Thunder Basin has gotten out to these sites multiple times. I think the important thing is that first year or two, especially after you've had a flow event through the structure, is really, really critical. And then I think getting in every year or so. And then the other thing too is you want to, not only are you interested in whether the structures are maintaining themselves, but you also want to get in and see, well, when can we do a second layer, or what's our next phase? Because again, this is an iterative process. We're trying to harness this natural process of erosion, and bringing what we want to do is make sure that we continue that upward trend. If we just stop at one layer, we're kind of leaving things hanging. So it really depends on where you are. Some of the sites that big Zuni Bowl, the fancy Zuni Bowl I showed you a picture of, that site we can get in every year and put in new structures. More arid sites like the Thunder Basin sites, we may not have water flow through those for a year or 2 or 5. We don't know yet. Until we see water moving through these systems, we're just not sure. I mean, Lynette, we've been amazed at how fast hers have filled, but then again, she was in the heart of a huge fire. So it really depends. I encourage people to get out to their structures as often as possible, and under different conditions, just to see what's going on. Right after the snow comes off is going to be different than what you see during a summer thunderstorm. And so getting out there under those different kinds of conditions can be really important.
Anybody else have any other questions or thoughts you wanted to share? Another thing that I wanted to mention about our walk around, Paul, on Sunday, if I could share another picture here. And I've had a lot of people, when I've talked to the landowners around here about this process and what we're wanting to do, and types of erosion that we're trying to address. And I talk about these wet meadows, these wet areas, and everybody just kind of looks at me sideways. They're like, "We don't have any of those around here. We don't have areas like that." And I think that maybe the terminology of mesic areas or wet meadows, is misleading, because people think like, well, we don't have areas that are wet. We don't have areas where we have water staying in the system for long periods of time. And so I wanted to share this picture, and I apologize that my mapping program is making them on sideways here, but you can see this photo, and I remember looking at this and thinking like, oh, that's what I was trying to tell people that we're trying to address. And this is another picture from the project site, where Paul and I were walking around and looking at head cuts on Sunday. And when I took a picture of that, because I was like, this is the perfect time of year to see where the water is concentrating in this system, right? And to see, is this where we want the water? Do we need to move it? Are we? And then you can see when the head cut occurs, sometimes you can see how all of a sudden that water flow is changing, and all of a sudden you're losing, this green zone. And I even labeled this picture green zone on my when I took it, because I was like, hey, this is exactly what we're trying to look at and trying to target and trying to maintain, right? And so I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Paul, when people say, oh, we don't have these areas here, but then we can show them that picture and say, well, but we have water moving through this system, we just don't think about it in the same way maybe that we're talking sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, and I've started trying to modify the way I'm starting to try and say meadows, because really all meadows are alluvial features. They're depositional areas. It may not be a wet meadow every year, or it may not be a wet meadow all year long. It may only be a wet meadow when you have that thunderstorm system that comes in and soaks it up. But we know that these low gradient settings are going to collect and store moisture when it's in the system. What is a wet meadow? That's subjective, and I think it's like so many things. We threw a name on it early, and those of us that have been working on this for years have just, it's so natural for us to say wet meadow. Really what we're looking at is meadow management, but all meadows are depositional zones. They're low gradient settings that are areas that collect soil and moisture, and as a result are going to have a very unique and specific vegetative community, which is typically, especially for landowners, is what's really important. And I think maybe low elevation productivity areas. I mean, there's a number of terms you could throw on them, but really we're in meadow management. And I think all meadows are wet meadows at some point in time, because that's how the sediment gets there. And it's just I think, yeah, especially here, the concept of what a wet meadow is very different than what we're seeing in the Gunnison Basin at 8,000 feet. Those are, yes, we have sedges and rushes and things like that, but you're going to have a vegetative community in the meadow that is different than what you have in the uplands. But I think that picture is a great example of what we're trying to manage for, and getting out at this time of the year, in Colorado or in the high country where you can actually see snow melt and you can actually see water on the ground. That's always a great time. But out here on the plains, right as you have this initial flush of green and the uplands are still coarse and dry, it's really vivid and it really stands out. And I think that was something that we both commented on was, well, that's where we want to go, and you can see there was that one, for example, where those two streams came together, where one was confined into the head cut when there's this big broad floodplain that, rather than being green like the smaller tributary where you took this picture, and right adjacent to it was a big broad floodplain that the main channel was in, and it was completely yellow or brown. And great example of where we could have water when there's water in the system.
Yep. Exactly. So, I guess, anybody else have any other questions, or we still can answer some more if you want to throw them in the chat, or if you want to unmute and be brave and jump on and share a question that way too. So, I know the virtual is a little bit intimidating and they struggle to get the interaction sometimes, but we definitely want to make sure we address any thoughts or questions you have. So. Great. Well, we will send out contact info for our presenters. We are going to post these recordings on our website, and we will let you know once they are up, so that you can view those. And we'll be sharing their PowerPoints as well. And for those that are comfortable with that, and making this information available, like Paul said, we're all in this together. We're all learning, and Appreciate everybody taking time out of their day to join us today. And just as a little bit of housekeeping for the next session, so it will be in 2 weeks, and that will be April 30th. That's also a Wednesday, and we'll be starting up at 8:30 again. So we'll be sending out a meeting link for that to everybody that registered for the session 2 or either the all. And on day 2, we're going to be talking about project planning and partnerships. And so we're going to kind of take the next step on, we've identified some problems. We're starting to look around and be like, oh, wow, I'm starting to see some of that around here. And, and you're starting to want to look at identifying some places to start working. So we're going to talk about how do we set goals for the project, and how do we then use those goals to drive where we begin our work, how we select a project site to begin with, how we use those goals to also help drive kind of the development of that project, and how we can prioritize areas for wildlife habitat and things like that. And we'll talk about permitting, because that can be an issue depending on what type of system we're working in. We'll have a presentation from Wyoming DEQ talking about that process. And then we'll talk about partnerships and how those can also help to strengthen these projects, and how we can work together with different agencies and other entities to help bring these projects to pass. There's a lot of different entities that are working in this area right now, and it's super exciting to be able to partner and work together. And I think it always makes these projects better. A lot of times we can pull from financial resources, from expertise, and a variety of things to be able to make those functional. So with that, I think that's all that I had to cover. So again, our session 2 will be April 30th at 8:30 in the morning. So in 2 weeks. And I did want to thank the planning committee members, which I think most of them are on here today. But Lynette Supin with Pheasants Forever, she was one of our committee members. Autumn Holzgen from Montana Conservation Corps, Casey Nordine with the Mule Deer Foundation, Willow Bish with Wyoming Game and Fish, and then Brian Stampy, who is the contractor and owner of Canopy Care, and is one of the contractors that's been working with Lynette on her projects. And I want to thank them for all of their help on bringing this to pass. It would not be at the stage that it is without their input and thoughts and finessing of the process that we came up with here. So, and I want to thank Paul and Brian as well as our presenters. Thank you guys very much for taking the time to put your presentations together and come and present to us today. And thank again all of you for showing up. And yes, if there's not any more questions, I think we're ready to wrap up. And I think we'll call it a day. We'll let you get on with all the other fun stuff you have going on. And like Paul said, we'll provide their PowerPoints and their contact information. So if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to them. And Paul and Brian are both great resources in this field, and excited to work with them. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll catch up with you here in 2 weeks. So
Thanks, Caleb.
Thank you all.
Yep, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.